At 4:55 hours on February 14, 1945, in the frozen woods near the German town of Cleve, a sniper pressed his cheek against the cold steel of his rifle. The forest was silent. Snow clung to the branches. Breath turned into white fog in the air. He had been there for hours, motionless, listening. Then a single shot broke the silence. Moments later, another. When Allied troops cautiously moved forward, they found 3 German officers lying in the snow, each one killed with a single bullet to the head. There were no footprints, no shell casings, no sign of where the shooter had gone. German soldiers began whispering about a ghost, a shadow that appeared without warning, a sniper who could not be tracked. They called him the Ghost of the Trees. But this man was not German. He was not even European. He was Cree, a member of one of Canada's indigenous nations from the cold forests of northern Canada. His name was Francis Pegamagabo, and almost no one knows who he was. He did not fight for glory. He did not seek medals. He did not leave behind memoirs or interviews. He fought in silence. And when the war ended, he vanished back into the wilderness. This is not a story told from Washington or Berlin. This is not the version found in most history books. This is a Canadian story, an Indigenous story, a story of a man whose skills were forged long before the war began, before Europe burned, before the Nazis marched, before the world collapsed into violence. Before he became a ghost, Francis Pegamagabo was a hunter, a tracker, and a boy raised to survive where others could not. This is his story, and this is a side of World War II that history nearly erased. Francis Pegamagabo was not raised in a barracks nor trained in military academies. He was born in the wilderness, and the wilderness raised him. He came into the world on March 9, 1891, on the shores of Perry Island in Ontario, Canada, a cold and windswept land surrounded by lakes and dense forest. His mother died when he was just a baby. His father passed soon after. Francis was raised by his Shawanaga elders, men and women of the Anishinaabe people, who taught through silence, patience, and example. As a child, Francis learned to read the forest. Not books, but the wind, the tracks in the snow, the rustle of a branch, the stillness before the arrival of a predator. While other children played in schoolyards, Francis was walking miles through icy woods with nothing but snowshoes and instinct. He could tell the age of an animal by the depth of its tracks, tell direction by the shape of broken twigs, tell if someone was lying by the rhythm of their heartbeat. He hunted elk, rabbits, wolves, not for sport, but to feed his people, to honor their traditions, to survive. His rifle was not a tool of violence, but a tool of precision, a test of discipline. If you missed a shot in the forest, there was no second chance, no applause, only hunger. His people believed the land was alive. The trees watched, the rivers whispered. You did not conquer the wild. You listened to it, you respected it, and if it allowed you to walk its paths, you were lucky. By the time Francis was 16, he could move through the woods without leaving a trace. He could sit still in the snow for hours without twitching a muscle. He could hear the difference between a falling branch and a distant footstep. What others called superhuman, Francis simply called home. In the teachings of the Anishinaabe, there is a concept called Mino Bimadiziwin, the good life. It is not measured in wealth or fame, but in balance with nature, respect for ancestors, and courage in the face of fear. Francis was not fearless. He simply knew that fear was part of life, and you faced it with calm breath and steady hands. He was not a man of many words. He spoke Ojibwe and English, but rarely said more than necessary. When he spoke, it mattered. This silence, this presence, this ability to observe without disturbing would one day make him invisible to his enemies and irreplaceable to his allies. Long before the war, Francis had already survived countless winters, crossed frozen rivers with broken snowshoes, tracked wounded elk for 3 days without rest, and endured frostbite, hunger, and isolation. No battlefield could intimidate him. He had already learned how to survive when death was always near. When the first rumors of war reached the Perry Island Reserve, Francis did not hesitate. Not because he loved the British Empire, not because he felt loyalty to politicians who barely acknowledged his people, but because he believed that protecting others was part of being a warrior, and warriors fight when others cannot. He enlisted with the Canadian Expeditionary Force in 1914, before most non-Indigenous Canadians even understood where the trenches were. He wore the uniform of a nation that had denied him basic rights, a country that barred him from voting, from owning certain land, from speaking his own language in public. But he fought anyway, because warriors do not fight for recognition. They fight for what is right. Francis Pegamagabo brought the forest with him to the front lines. He did not need praise. He did not seek fame. He had a rifle. He had patience. And he had decades of survival etched into his bones. To most soldiers, the battlefield was chaos. To Francis, it was just another kind of hunting ground, a place where silence could save lives, where the wind could betray a target, where instinct was stronger than orders. It was not the war that shaped Francis. It was the forest. And that forest never left him. Not even in the mud of the trenches or the frozen woods of Europe or the ruined villages echoing with gunfire. He was not a soldier who became a ghost. He was a ghost who became a soldier. Francis Pegamagabo enlisted in August 1914, barely a month after war was declared. He was 23 years old. He walked nearly 200 kilometers from Perry Island to the nearest recruitment office. He was rejected at first. The recruiting officer told him, "Indians are not needed in this white man's war." But Francis insisted, and days later, he was accepted into the Canadian Expeditionary Force. He became part of the 1st Canadian Infantry Battalion, badge number 434. He didn't join as a marksman or a scout or a sniper. He joined as a simple private. The Army didn't care about his years of tracking or his ability to move silently or his skills with a rifle. To them, he was just another native recruit, useful, disposable, and barely recognized. At the time, Indigenous people in Canada were still not legally recognized as full citizens. They had no voting rights, no legal protection, and were often forced onto reserves with poor resources. And yet more than 4,000 First Nations men enlisted in the war. They signed up to fight for a country that treated them as second-class citizens. Some hoped to prove themselves. Others hoped the war might change things for their people. And some, like Francis, simply followed the warrior code that had been passed down for generations. You defend, you protect, even when you are not protected yourself. In 1914, the world descended into madness. Empires collided, trench lines stretched for hundreds of kilometers, and modern weapons turned farmland into hell. Canada, as part of the British Empire, sent more than 600,000 soldiers overseas. Among them, the sons of farmers, loggers, miners, and a few who didn't speak a word of English. Francis stood out immediately, not because of his heritage, but because of how he moved, how he observed, how he fired. During basic training, he hit every target with precision. His instructors were impressed. His fellow soldiers were quiet around him. They didn't understand him, but they knew he was different. He said little. He trained hard. He preferred to sleep outdoors, even when barracks were available. He didn't complain. He didn't show off. But when the time came to deploy to Europe, he was ready. The Canadian battalion sailed to England in late 1914, and by February 1915, they were in the trenches of Belgium. That's where the war began to change Francis. Not because he feared it, but because it reminded him of something familiar. The silence, the stillness, the way death could come from any direction at any moment. Most soldiers panicked. Francis listened. Most shouted orders. Francis watched the crows. He knew when shelling was coming by the way the birds flew. He could hear movement in the mud before the others even picked up their rifles. He began to take on special assignments: scouting, reconnaissance, silent infiltration. He'd leave the trenches in the middle of the night, crawl into no man's land, find German positions, mark them silently, and return before sunrise. Sometimes he brought back enemy maps, sometimes prisoners. Sometimes he left behind nothing but confusion. At first, his superiors didn't know what to make of him. He broke the mold. He didn't fit the standard soldier template. He didn't drink. He didn't joke. He didn't join in the songs or card games. But when they saw what he could do, they gave him freedom. He became a lone wolf, sent out to do what others couldn't. He wasn't just a sniper. He was a scout, a ghost, a shadow. And as his legend grew, so did the respect and the fear among those who knew his name. Even among the Germans, there were rumors of a native marksman who could see in the dark and vanish into the fog. But within the Canadian Army, racism still followed him. He was denied promotions, he was paid less. He was called slurs behind his back. He was told he'd never be an officer, not because he lacked skill, but because he wasn't white. Francis didn't answer those insults with words, he answered with results. While other men fired dozens of rounds and missed, Francis waited patiently and fired once. He was eventually promoted to lance corporal, but it took years. And even then, it came grudgingly. To the officers who denied him, he was still just an Indian. To the men in the trenches, he was the one who always came back and brought intel that saved lives. He fought at Ypres, at the Somme, and in the trenches of Passchendaele, where entire regiments disappeared into mud and shellfire. He survived gas attacks, sniper duels, and frostbite. He never asked for help. He never asked for praise. He simply returned to his position, loaded his rifle, and waited for the next mission. By the end of the First World War, Francis Pegamagabo had become the most effective sniper in the entire Canadian military. But few knew his name, and fewer still cared to say it correctly. He had over 370 confirmed kills and more than 300 successful scouting missions. Yet even after all that, he would return to a country that barely recognized what he had done. The war had changed Europe, but it had not changed Canada. At least not for men like Francis. The trenches of Europe were not built for humans. They were scars carved into the earth, filled with water, rats, and death. Mud clung to everything. Shells screamed overhead at all hours. Gas drifted in with the morning fog. And nowhere felt safe. For most men, just surviving another day was the goal. But Francis Pegamagabo was not like most men. He did not just survive, he hunted. His first mission as a sniper came in early 1915, just outside Ypres, Belgium. The weather was miserable. The ground was frozen, the trees skeletal and black. The Germans had placed machine gun nests in a barn overlooking Allied trenches. They had cut down dozens of soldiers over the past few nights. No one could get close. That's when they sent Francis. He disappeared into the frost-covered brush before sunrise. Alone. No backup. No cover. For 6 hours he crawled through mud, sometimes belly deep in icy water, not making a single sound. He used dead branches to disguise his outline. He froze in place when patrols passed within meters of him. He even covered his rifle barrel with cloth to keep the metal from reflecting sunlight. When he finally reached position, he waited. He did not breathe heavily. He did not fidget. He became part of the land. The Germans never saw him. At dusk, a German machine gunner stood to stretch. Francis fired once. The man dropped. A second soldier rushed to the body. Another shot. Silence. The machine gun nest was never used again. That single mission changed everything. His commanders realized they had a weapon unlike any other. They began assigning him sniper missions almost daily. Some lasted hours, some lasted days. Francis preferred to operate alone. He moved silently through no man's land, sometimes crawling for kilometers just to take a single shot. His camouflage was legendary. He would smear mud on his face, blend into tree lines, and even tie pieces of grass and cloth to his uniform to match the terrain. German snipers hunted him. Scouts tried to track him, but none succeeded. He became a ghost. A whisper passed between frightened officers, a figure seen just before someone dropped dead. But sniping was not just about killing. It was about control. It was psychological warfare. When Francis was on the line, German movement slowed. Patrols hesitated. Officers stopped standing in the open. They never knew where the bullet would come from, only that it would arrive, quiet and final. Francis did not boast. He did not keep trophies. He did not cheer after a successful kill. He simply marked it in his mind, adjusted his scope, and waited for the next. He preferred to target officers, spotters, radio men, those whose deaths would cause confusion, break morale, slow the enemy machine. He was not interested in numbers. He was interested in results, and the results spoke for themselves. By the end of 1916, he had over 100 confirmed kills. His reputation spread beyond his unit. Commanders requested him by name. Other snipers asked to train with him, but Francis trained no one. His methods were his own, passed down from the forest, not from textbooks. On more than one occasion, he returned from missions with critical intelligence. He memorized the layout of enemy trenches, located hidden artillery, and once even overheard a German officer discussing the timing of an upcoming assault. That information saved hundreds of Allied lives, but official recognition was rare. His reports were signed, filed, forgotten. Others received medals. Francis received more missions. He did not complain. He believed warriors did their duty, even when no one watched. Especially then. Sniper work was not glorious. It was cold, isolated, and brutal. He spent hours lying motionless in wet soil, his body cramping, his fingers stiff with cold. He endured hunger, infection, and once a shrapnel wound that he treated himself with strips of cloth and pine sap. He survived a mustard gas attack by dragging a wounded comrade on his back through 6 kilometers of toxic fog. When they asked him later how he did it, he said nothing. He just looked away and cleaned his rifle. By the end of the war, Francis Pegamagabo had become the most effective sniper in the entire Allied force. His confirmed kill count stood at over 370. His unconfirmed, no one will ever know. He was credited with more than 300 successful reconnaissance missions behind enemy lines. He had become a one-man army, an intelligence source, a legend. And yet, his name barely made it into the history books. His people knew. His brothers in arms knew. But the country he fought for? They barely noticed. Francis did not seek praise, but history should have given it to him. His early missions shaped the outcome of many small battles that never made the headlines. He was not just a sniper. He was a symbol of what a human being can do with silence, discipline, and a purpose stronger than fear. Most soldiers in the trenches feared 2 things they could not see: artillery from above and snipers from afar. But there was one sniper whose name was spoken in whispers, not just by Germans, but by Canadians too. They called him the Phantom. Some said he could see at night. Others swore he could smell gunpowder from a mile away. His name was Francis Pegamagabo, but by 1917 he was no longer just a man. He was a myth. Stories spread quickly in war, and his story spread like wildfire. One tale said he once infiltrated a German trench alone at night and left behind a message scrawled in blood: "Your eyes are open, but you do not see me." Another said he could hold his breath for over 2 minutes, long enough to take a shot without fogging his scope in freezing temperatures. A third claimed he killed 5 enemy snipers in a single day by mimicking bird calls to lure them out. None of these stories were ever officially confirmed. Francis never spoke about them, and that only made the legends grow. He rarely spoke. But when he did, soldiers listened. He didn't shout. He didn't give orders. But his quiet presence brought calm in the middle of chaos. Before missions, he would sit alone, closing his eyes, breathing slow, as if he were somewhere else, somewhere far from the mud and blood. Many believed he entered a trance, communing with spirits, seeking guidance from ancestors. To some, it was superstition. To others, it was power. And when his bullet found its mark every time, some began to wonder if it really was just skill. German prisoners were often asked what scared them the most. Some said artillery, some said gas, but others said, "Der Geist in den Bäumen." The ghost in the trees. They never knew when he would strike. A man walking to deliver a message suddenly fell, lifeless. A radio operator silenced mid-sentence. A spotter collapsed before he could raise his binoculars. There was never a second shot, just one, always clean, always final. The myth grew bigger than even Francis himself. Soldiers in his own unit began leaving offerings in his dugout for good luck: tobacco, buttons, bits of chocolate. One man claimed his life was saved because he shared tea with Francis the night before. Another refused to go on patrol unless Francis tied a string around his wrist for protection. Even officers began deferring to him in planning ambushes and scouting. He had no official command, but no one questioned him. He knew where the enemy would move. He knew where to dig. He knew when to wait and when to strike. The German High Command reportedly placed a bounty on his head. The amount was never confirmed, but word spread. Snipers were ordered to find him, but none succeeded, because Francis never stayed in the same spot twice. He never fired from obvious positions. He used the land, trees, brush, shadows. He became part of the forest, even in Europe. Not all soldiers respected him. Some mocked him, behind his back called him a savage, a relic, a curiosity. But those same men stood a little closer to him in the trenches, watched him when shells started falling, and when someone asked who was on the line that night, they always relaxed when the answer was, "Pega Magabo is watching." He didn't write letters to newspapers, he didn't give speeches, but when he walked back from a mission with enemy maps in his hands and mud frozen to his face, no one dared question who he was. Francis had become more than a soldier. He was a presence, a figure shaped by snow, silence, and shadows. Even after the war, stories of him lingered. Veterans told tales to their sons about the indigenous
In the final
sniper
year
who
of the
walked
war,
without
Francis
sound
Pega
and saw
Magabo
without
was no
light.
longer just a sniper.
To the people of his community,
He was a
he
symbol.
had always been a warrior.
He had survived
to the
Ypres,
army,
the Somme,
he was a weapon.
Passchendaele,
But to those who
Amiens,
lived through the
and
war,
the 100 Days
Francis
Offensive,
Pega Magabo was a
battles that
legend
shattered
carved into the
divisions,
battlefield,
battles
like a
that
ghost
erased
never
names
left from stone crosses. But Francis kept returning, quiet, focused, unchanged. His kill count had passed 300, his confirmed reconnaissance missions over 350, but he never counted them himself. He was not keeping score. He was keeping his brothers alive. One of his final missions came in late 1918, just weeks before the armistice. Allied forces were pushing into German-occupied towns. Resistance was crumbling, but pockets of snipers remained, slowing down entire battalions with single bullets. Francis was sent into one of these towns alone. The fog was thick, the buildings crumbling, and German riflemen were firing from the church steeple. Other snipers had failed. Too exposed, too loud, too late. Francis entered through a sewer, crawling, half submerged for hundreds of meters. He emerged in the back of a burned-out bakery, climbed silently to the roof, and took a single shot. The bell tower went still. The Allied advance resumed within minutes. No one saw him take the shot. No one saw him leave, but they all knew who had done it. On November 11, 1918, the war ended. Francis had served every year of the conflict, from the opening volleys to the final whistle. He returned with 3 awards for bravery, the Military Medal plus 2 bars, a combination achieved by no other Indigenous soldier in the entire Canadian Army. But there was no parade waiting for him, no land grant, no pension, not even a formal thank you. When Francis returned to the Perry Island Reserve, he found his people poorer than before. He had left as a hero in uniform. He returned as an Indian again. He could not vote. He could not speak his own language in schools. He was denied the same benefits as white veterans. He had to fight, too, even wear his medals in public. The government did not see a warrior. They saw a problem. Francis did not accept it. He began a second fight, not with bullets, but with words. He became an advocate for Indigenous rights. He fought for better treatment of veterans, for autonomy and Indigenous governance, for respect. But his efforts were often met with silence. The same silence he once used to stalk enemies now followed him in meetings with politicians. He was arrested multiple times for protesting the Indian Act, branded a troublemaker, a nuisance. He grew quieter over the years. He never stopped advocating, but the war had taken its toll. The things he had seen, the friends he had buried, they followed him like shadows. He never talked about the men he killed, never bragged, never exaggerated. He returned to the forest and walked among the trees again. But he no longer hunted. He no longer fired a rifle. He died in 1952 at the age of 61, still living on the same reserve that had barely recognized him. Decades passed. The world forgot. History books left him out. Canadian schools did not mention him. His medals were hidden in drawers, his name buried beneath layers of ignorance. But his people remembered. The Anishinaabe passed down his story, a boy who became a warrior who became a ghost who became a symbol. Today, statues of Francis Pega Magabo stand in Ontario. Museums carry his name. The Canadian military honors him as one of the greatest snipers in its history. But the truth is, he was never just a sniper. He was a tracker, a protector, a man who fought for a nation that did not fight for him in return. He served in silence. He returned in silence. But his story refuses to stay quiet. Francis Pega Magabo did not seek fame, but he earned it. He did not ask for medals, but he earned them. He did not want to be remembered, but he must be. Because history is not just the story of empires and generals. It is the story of men like Francis who walked through fire and returned with nothing except honor. In the end, he was not just a Canadian soldier. He was not just Cree. He was both. A fusion of two worlds, one ancient, one broken, and he carried both into war. He left behind no autobiography, no famous last words, no glory. But the next time someone tells you that history is only written by the victors, tell them about the ghost in the trees.